Okay, we thought we'd try to make this video today to try to make it a little bit easier to remotely be able to study the pre-trip inspection. Remembering that the pre-trip inspection is one of 3 skills that you'll be required to do the day of the test. So when the truck happens to be sitting in the shop right now, but if we were out on the testing site, the truck will be stationary, and before we get going, the first thing we need to do is chalk the rear wheels so that the vehicle can't move. Then we're going to take the keys out of the ignition, and then we'll go ahead and start the pre-trip. Okay, the wheels are chalked. I'm going to take the keys out of the ignition, and I'm also going to turn the marker lights on so that I can check the marker lights around the vehicle while we're walking around. I'll take the keys and I'm going to set them right here on the step. Okay, so the very most important part of a pre-trip inspection is going to be maintaining a system that you use every single time. In other words, if we jump around the truck, we aren't going to be able to remember each and every one of these components, and it's going to be easier to get lost. So my goal is to use the same plan every single time. That way it becomes, you don't forget it. It becomes familiar and you remember it, okay? So I start with the front of the truck, and I'm going to point out that all of the marker lights are clean and working properly. We have a current Vermont inspection sticker. I'm going to want to reach up, and if you can't reach it, you may have to climb up on the wheel or up on the step, but I'm going to show the examiner that the windshield wiper has enough proper spring tension to hold it nice and tight to the windshield. Also pointing out that there's no cracks or chips in that glass either. These 2 fender mirrors are secured, and we don't run the risk of them falling off while we're going down the road. These 2 corner marker lights both work. The headlights are secured in the truck. The grille is secured on the truck and not going to come off while we drive down the road. The bumper is secured on the truck and not going to come off while we drive down the road. While I'm here on the front of the truck, I also want to make sure that I look underneath the truck to make sure that we don't have any drips or leaks, maybe from the water pump, power steering pump, engine oil, anything like that. So making sure that there's no leaks anywhere underneath the truck. Then we're going to move along and we're going to pre-trip 1 complete steer axle. In order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and pop the hood. Make sure that you're familiar with how the hood latches work before the day of your test so that you don't look like you don't know what you're doing. I always tell people when they're tilting the hood to make sure that when you lift, you put your shoulder into it and make sure that the hood is caught by its whatever latch. This one happens to be 2 hydraulic arms. But if we were not familiar with the truck and a cable or one of those rams wasn't secured, the hood would come down and slam onto the ground and possibly break. Okay, so with the engine compartment available to see here, we can better pre-trip 1 complete steer axle. Okay, now we move over to pre-trip 1 complete steer axle. And with the hood open, we can better see all the components that are harder to see. Before I start that front wheel, we want to show the examiner that we have the tools available to check things the way they should, like a flashlight and an air pressure gauge. So the first thing we want to point out is that the wheel itself, the steel wheel, has no cracks, breaks, or illegal weld marks in it where it may have been repaired. Then we want to show that the lug nuts are secured to the wheel and there's no shiny spots or long streaks of rust indicating that these are loose and it may have been chucking while we're driving down the road. We want to point out that this hub oil seal right here is not dripping any oil anywhere, and it's not splattered around the inside of the wheel, indicating that the seal might be bad. Then we move up to the tire itself. The rubber tire has no dry rot, cracks, or bulges anywhere in it. That the tire is properly inflated, so we use our air pressure gauge to actually go ahead, okay, and show that we've got these tires happen to be 100 pounds, and that's what we run all the way around in this truck. So the tire is properly inflated. The top of the tire doesn't indicate that it's being worn funny. The tread is evenly worn, and it has at least 4 seconds of tread in every one of these grooves. As I move to the inside of the tire, I'll use my flashlight to make sure that I don't have any dry rot, cracks, or bulges on the inside of the tire either. So that takes care of the tire. Now, we've got all of these other components that hook to the tire. We're going to start with the steering shaft, the power steering box, the pitman arm, the drag link, the steering arm, and the tie rod. Okay? So for that, I use a rag because it's a little bit greasy. And the first thing I'll do is I'll grab the steering shaft to make sure that it's secure and it's not loose. That steering shaft comes down to a big power steering box that's secured to the side of the frame. So we're going to point out that it's secured. There's no leaks in either of the gaskets where the pitman arm and the steering shaft hook into the power steering box. The power steering reservoir, the hose that comes from the reservoir down to the pump, there's no leaks there. And we'll actually get to the power steering fluid a little bit later when we do the engine compartment. We checked that the pitman arm is secured on the truck. We checked that where the pitman arm secures to the drag link, that the drag link is secured. And we also want to point out that it has a castle nut and a cotter key here, and a castle nut and a cotter key down where it hooks to the steering arm. The steering arm itself is secure, and there's my tie rod down there that's also secured and connects the two tires together. Then we have our brake components. We have an air line that doesn't have any leaks and is secured to the frame and to the air chamber. We have an air chamber that also has no leaks. And then there's a slack adjuster on the front of the air chamber. And you would point out to the examiner that you would pull on that slack adjuster, and it can't have more than 1 inch of play. You also have to point out to the examiner that the spring brakes are currently on in the truck. So therefore, the slack adjuster is not going to move at all. But you would ask the examiner, would you like me to release the spring brakes so that I can check to make sure that it doesn't have 1 inch of play or more? And most often, they're going to say no, just as long as you understand how you would check it. Okay. This air chamber, no leaks, slack adjuster, no more than 1 inch of play. We come down to the inside of the wheel, and we've got a dust shield that has a couple of inspection holes in it. I'm looking in the inspection hole to make sure that the drum itself is not heated or discolored, which would indicate that it had been really hot. I'm also checking through the inspection hole that the brake pads and linings don't have any cracks or breaks, or they're not worn dangerously thin. And that takes care of the brakes. So then we move on to the suspension. We have a front and a rear spring hanger that are secured to the frame. We've got 2 leaf springs, and there's no cracks or breaks in either of those leaves. The U-bolts that secure the leaf springs to the front axle are secured. This shock absorber, we're pointing out that there's no oil running down the outside of it, which would indicate that the shock was blown, and it's secured to the frame. Now, while there's lots of other things in the engine bay that need to be mentioned, I prefer to mention them all at once when we do the engine bay. So at this point, we're actually going to move down the vehicle. Okay, we've got a splash guard that's secured to the truck. We've got 2 steps that we use to access inside and out, and they're secured to the truck. Okay, we've got a battery box. And we're pointing out to the examiner that the batteries are secured and they're not going to be flopping around when we drive down the road. And also that there's no corrosion on the top of each of the connections, which would indicate you had a loose connection. Make sure you secure the battery box lid back on. And we'll continue to move down the side of the truck. the door opens and closes as it should. The side mirror is secured on the truck, and none of the glass has any breaks in it anywhere. Okay, we have a DEF fluid tank for our exhaust fluid, okay? We need to point out that the bracket is secured to the frame, that the tank has no leaks, and that the cap is secure. Same with the fuel tank. We're going to point out that the cap is secure, that the two straps that hold the tank to the frame are secure, and there's no leaks on the bottom of the tank anywhere. We continue to check our cab and the fairings to make sure that they're secure, that these steps are secure, and the marker lights are all working as we move down the side. Okay, now we're going to keep on working our way down through, and we're going to get one complete drive axle. So as we work our way down through, we want to make sure that the frame isn't overly rusty and there's no holes, there's no cracks or breaks in the frame. Okay, these two splash guards are secure. And then, just like the front steer axle, we're going to work our way from the outside of the tire to the inside of the brakes and then to the suspension. So again, I have my air pressure gauge. I point out that the tire itself is in decent shape. There's no dry rot, cracks, or bulges. That the tire is properly inflated. And I would go ahead and use my air gauge again to show the examiner that we have the proper amount of air pressure in the tire, and it should be around 100 again. And we're good. And make sure that this cap gets secured on there. And that the tire has at least 2 30-seconds of tread in every major groove on these drive tire. We also want to point out that the wheel itself doesn't have any cracks, breaks, or illegal weld marks. That this axle seal is not dripping any oil. You don't see it splattered around the inside of the wheel. Okay, the lug nuts themselves, there's no shiny spots or rust streaks indicating that the lug nuts themselves are loose and the wheel might be chucking a little bit. We mentioned that the sideboards are secured, and these rub rails are secured on the side of the truck as well. As we come around, we mentioned that the splash guards are secure. We have a set of wheels that does not require a wheel spacer. We need to point that out. But we also want to point out that there's nothing stuck between the dual wheels. Okay? This tire appears to be in good condition as well. It's properly inflated. The tread itself, at least 2 30-seconds of tread in every major groove. Before we start the actual back of the truck, we have to finish up the underside and the brake components on this truck. And for this, you actually will have to lay down on the ground. The examiner's going to want to see that you know what you're talking about. All right, I'm checking again that the brake drums are not blued in color or show any cracks or signs of overheating. Again, through those inspection holes, I'm looking to show the examiner that the brake linings themselves don't have any cracks or breaks and they're not worn dangerously thin. Okay, I've got that same slack adjuster that, again, I would point out to the examiner, the spring brakes are on, so it's not going to move, but if the spring brakes were off, it shouldn't have any more than 1 inch of play, and it never hurts to ask the examiner if they want you to release the spring brakes and check that. The air chamber itself isn't leaking. I don't hear any air leaking from it. And the air line that runs down to the air chamber doesn't have any leaks in it. Slack adjuster, no more than 1 inch of play. We talked about the drum and the brake shoes, so that takes care of the brakes. Now, we're going to talk about the suspension. Each truck is going to be different, but this particular truck has a combination of both leaf springs and airbags. So we need to point out that the airbag doesn't have any leaks in it. I don't hear any air whistling out of it. That the 2 springs that are in here are not cracked or broken. That the U-bolts hold the springs to the axle are secure. And there's actually a shock absorber tucked up in there as well, and that doesn't have any oil leaking from it. While we're here, we want to point out that the rear end differential is not leaking any oil anywhere. And now we can pre-trip the back of the truck. Every truck's going to be different, but this particular truck, the tailboard is secured in the stake pockets and it's not going anywhere. All of our marker lights work the way they should. The pintle hitch is secured. The glad hands and light connections are secured. That we have the proper DOT reflective tape. That we have a current registration and the license plate secured. And the splash guards are secure on both sides. Now, the examiner, in the interest of time, will not ask you to pre-trip the entire passenger side of the truck. What they will ask, if there's anything different on this side of the truck from the driver's side, let's go ahead and mention that. Okay, so a couple of things that we didn't mention from the driver's side that I usually mention on the passenger side are the drive shaft. The drive shaft, what you're mentioning about the drive shaft is that it doesn't have any dents or dings in it that may make it shake or wobble or run out of true. Again, we have the same drive axle, the same fuel tank, so we don't need to mention that. But we do have the exhaust system on this side of the truck. So we want to be careful that the exhaust isn't hot, and we grab this guard on the outside and we make sure that the exhaust is secure and that all the connections down through there are also secure and there's no cracks so we don't have any exhaust leaking. Okay, also on this side of the truck, we have the exhaust filter for the Tier 4 engine emissions. And what we're pointing out about that is that the exhaust itself is all tight and the good connections, but there's a lot of electrical connections that apply in here. And we're making sure that those are secured and the connections are tight the way that they're supposed to be. And the exhaust filter itself is secured tightly to the side of the truck. Okay, the engine bay. We're going to work starting from the passenger side over to the driver's side. We're going to make sure that we have the proper amount of windshield washer fluid. We're going to point out that our alternator is secured to the frame. And also you need to mention that the two connections that are electrical connections on the alternator are secured. And then the belt that runs the alternator, the water pump, the power steering pump, all AC pump, all of those components uses a serpentine belt. And you're pulling on the belt to make sure that the idler pulley works the way that it should, that the belt has no dry rot or abrasions in it so that it works the way it's supposed to. These are my AC lines, not so important to mention. Now behind my fan is the crankshaft, and behind the fan is also the water pump. You and I can't see the water pump, and the examiner can't see the water pump either, but you need to mention that the water pump doesn't have any leaks. So the water pump's not leaking, and again, the same serpentine belt runs that. So from this side of the truck, we have the alternator and its connections, the belt, which is a serpentine belt, and we have the water pump. From the driver's side of the engine compartment, we have this transparent coolant tank, which you can see is at the proper level. We have a transparent power steering fluid reservoir, which is at the proper level. We'd already mentioned the hose down to the pump, but we can mention it again, it's not leaking. Okay, the power steering pump is tucked away down in there, we can't see it, but we're going to point out with our flashlight that it's not leaking. And again, we look at the belt, the serpentine belt on this side to make sure that it's in decent shape, it's not cracked or dry rotted or has no abrasions. We're going to actually pull the engine oil dipstick to show the examiner that it's at the proper level. Okay, we're going to point out that the air compressor is mounted here in the back of the engine, and I don't hear any air leaks from it or the lines that come from it. We're going to point out that this bank of air lines and electrical connections and fuse and relay boxes are secured to the firewall. Need to mention that. So in review, under the hood, we've got the alternator and its connections. We're checking to make sure that the water pump's not leaking. We're checking our coolant level, our power steering level, the power steering pump and the belt and the hose from the reservoir to the box, the engine oil, and the compressor. Those are the under the hood things that we need to mention. Also, not forgetting that the air lines and electrical connections are secured to the firewall. And that takes care of everything under the engine, in the engine bay. Before we move into the in-cab, we want to make sure that we shut and secure the hood. Make sure we latch both sides. And we're going to want to make sure that we check all the lights. We already checked the marker lights, but we want to check the headlights with high and low beam, our directionals, our four-ways, and our brake lights and reverse lights. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the headlights on. Now this particular truck, the key needs to be in the ignition in order for the high beams to work. So I turn the key in the ignition and turn it on to accessory. I can see that both of my headlights work. I'm going to go ahead and snap my high beams on. Both of the high beams work. I'm going to go ahead and turn my four-ways on and make sure that the four-ways are on in the back and that the four-ways are on in the front, including both side markers. I'm going to go ahead and shut those four-ways off and turn my left directional on. Works in the front, the side, and the rear. And the same with the right directional. Directional works in the front corner, the side, and then the rear. Now the tricky part is that we can't check the brake lights and the reverse lights without the help of the examiner. So at this point, before you enter the cab, you'll have to say to the examiner, would you please help me check my brake lights in reverse? And of which they will oblige. They'll walk back there, they'll tell you to put your brakes on, and they'll tell you to put your reverse lights on. Once all the lights have been tested, you and the examiner are going to move into the cab. Okay, before we get in the truck, we want to take our tools and put them back into the door. We want to make sure that the grease and oil is off our hands so that we don't get the truck filthy. Then we're going to go ahead and climb into the truck. And the examiner is going to want to see the truck running when we go ahead and do the in-cab pre-trip inspection. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start the truck. We're going to start on the driver's side. We're going to start on the driver's side. We're going to work our way across the dash, ending over on the passenger side, and then kind of through the middle. So we need to point out that these are our window functions and they work as they should. This is our mirror adjuster, and the mirrors are adjusted so that I can see. Okay, this is my oil pressure gauge and it's at the normal operating range. This is my water temperature gauge and it's at its operating range. My tachometer, speedometer, fuel gauge with a lit up display of the amount of exhaust fluid that's in there. I have two air pressure gauges, one for each side of each tank. The wheel is a 20-inch wheel, and it doesn't have any more than 2 inches of play in it. On the wheel we have our horn. We also have an air horn. We have our cruise control and engine brake controls. We have our trailer air brake supply, which we don't have a trailer. We have our spring brake supply gauge. We have our trailer brake, a driver red brake. We've got our light dimmer switch for our dash, our four-ways, heated mirrors, engine brake, regeneration switch, engine shutdown in case the truck wants to do a regen and you want to override it, our dome light, our utility lights, our defroster, and you have to show the examiner that the defroster works on all speeds. We have a clutch and a gear selector, our service brake pedal, and our throttle. We also have a two-way radio that's secured. We have our safety belts on both sides. There's no cuts or abrasions. Same over here. And down behind the seat, we actually have 3 reflective triangles and a properly charged fire extinguisher. And we have to point those out to the examiner as well. We need to show that the windshield washers work on all speeds and that the windshield washer fluid works. Again, mentioning there's no cracks or breaks in the glass or the windows on the doors. That everything is secured in the truck overhead. Make sure that these are closed and nothing's going to fall out on us while we drive. Okay, once we've mentioned all of the safety components and operating components of the truck, then we need to move to an air brake test. So the wheels are chalked. We're going to go ahead and shut the truck off so the engine shuts off. And then we're going to go ahead and turn it on one click so that all of our gauges work the way they're supposed to. Sorry about that. So that all of our gauges work the way that they should. Okay. We're going to go ahead and we're going to release the spring brakes. That's the start of our air brake test. We're going to wait for that initial drop to make sure that all the needles stop working. Okay, remember that the truck just took a huge gulp of air to fill up all of the brake chambers and air lines. Now the test first calls out a static test. So for this, we're going to want to make sure that we have a timer. And I use my phone, and it seems to be what everybody uses now. So we set our timer. And then the first test is the static test, and we can't lose more than 2 pounds or 2 psi in 1 minute. So we would go ahead and start, and we would literally, with our feet on the floor, just make sure that the truck doesn't leak down any more than 2 psi in a minute. Now in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and stop, and we're going to say that was a minute and we dropped no air. We're going to reset our time, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check to make sure that we have no leaks in our air system by pressing on the service brake. When I step on the service brake, the gauges will take a little gulp of air and drop back a little bit. I hold firmly on the pedal. I start my timer, and we can't leak down any more than 3 psi in a minute with the air fully charged through the system. So I would hold my foot on there until I reached my 1 minute. And I wouldn't try to cheat it. I would wait until you get to that 1 minute and make sure the examiner knows. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and stop this test. I'm going to stop my clock and say, yes, in 1 minute we did not leak down any more than 3 psi. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is check to make sure that the safety functions of the air brake system work as they should. So I'm going to pump down the brake pedal. Every time I pump it down, you hear the air exhaust off. And in this truck, it's where the red starts, but it's at 60 pounds. At 60 psi, we should hear a warning light and buzzer that comes on. We should see the light on the dash, and we need to point out that we can see the light on the dash and hear a buzzer that tells us we have low air at 60 psi. There's my light, and you can hear the buzzer. So those work the way they're supposed to. I'm going to continue to feather the service brake down, and at around 20 psi, our spring brake knob is automatically going to pop out of the dash, letting us know that the spring brakes are in adjustment and that the emergency brake works as it should. And the knob popped out, and if I push it in, we see that it comes out on its own. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and start the truck again. We need to make sure that our air compressor builds and replaces the air in our tanks as quickly as it should. So we're going to wait till these needles come up to 85 psi, which is the next notch, in this truck anyway, the next notch after the red. Now if I step on the accelerator and speed the engine up, the compressor will build air faster. We're going to go ahead and get our stopwatch ready again. Reset it, and when it hits that 85, we're going to start our timer. Okay, so we're starting, and remember we have to build from 85 psi to 100 psi in 45 seconds or less. And that's showing the examiner that we have a good strong air compressor that can replenish the air in the air system as we use it for our brakes. So it's 85 to 100 in 45 seconds or less. Using our timer. In this case, we're just about there. So we're going to point out that we've now reached 100 psi, and we did it in 34 seconds. So we're well under the time that we need. So now as the compressor continues to build air, we wait for the air governor to cut out the compressor. In other words, the tanks are full, and you're going to hear that common whoosh of air as the air compressor shuts off, and that's going to happen at about 125 psi. Again, watching, there's the last notch, and at around 125 psi, we're going to hear the air governor shut off, and we'll hear that whoosh of air. And there's our air. Okay. Now, making sure that we're in neutral and that our parking brake's on, we're going to go ahead and exit the truck and remove the wheel chocks. The last two things that we need to check with the air brake system are that the brakes actually work. And I'm going to partially show you that and then theoretically talk about the next step. So the first thing is, while our parking brake is secured, we're going to select low gear. And we're gently, very gently, going to pull against that parking brake. And you can feel the truck move and hear the engine bog down, letting us know that the parking brake works. Then the second part of that is we're going to release the parking brake, again select low gear, and we're going to roll ahead at least 5 miles an hour and apply the service brake so that the examiner can see that the service brake works on the truck. Now we're not going to do that right now because we don't want to send our camera woman through the windshield, and we really don't have much room in the shop. But it is very important that on the test you move the vehicle forward at least 5 miles an hour, maybe even a little bit more, so that you can show that the service brake works. When you complete the air brake test, you can shut the truck off. And remember, the most important part of this pre-trip inspection is it's not over until you tell the examiner that it's over. So what I suggest is that you sit here and you reflect back through the pre-trip inspection just as you just did it. Starting with the front of the truck, moving to the front steer axle and all the components there, and down the driver's side of the vehicle, all the while thinking in your head of all the things that you were supposed to mention. Then go to the rear drive axle, the back of the truck, anything that was different up the passenger side of the truck, and say maybe while you're thinking about coming up the passenger side of the truck, you realize you forgot to mention the exhaust. Go ahead and exit the vehicle, go over, show the examiner what you want to check on the exhaust, that the exhaust is tight and that there's no leaks. And then you climb back in the truck, you think again, you come to the engine bay. I think I got everything in the engine bay. And then you go ahead and tell the examiner that you're done, but only when you're confident that you've listed off everything. And that will end the pre-trip. Now, one more bit of information that's important to consider when we talk about the pre-trip inspection is the pre-trip inspection that we just did is a full pre-trip. Okay, and when you pre-trip the entire vehicle with an air brake test, it takes about 40 minutes. Okay, now the day of your test, they're going to put your name into a computer, and so on this given date, the pre-trip that you're going to have today is one complete steer axle in the back of the vehicle in the in cab. In other words, you may get the entire pre-trip, but you're more likely to get parts of the pre-trip, like one complete steer axle, or one complete drive axle, or the engine bay. Whatever it may be, you will always do an in-cab inspection because the vehicle is equipped with air brakes. That air brake test, everybody will have to take if they're driving a vehicle with air brakes. So make sure that you're familiar with that. The other parts of it have been slightly trimmed down to try to save on time. But you may also get the entire pre-trip that day. So we have to be prepared to give the entire pre-trip and also be prepared to just give components of the pre-trip inspection, like one complete steer axle, the driver's side of the vehicle, one complete drive axle, or the back, or the engine bay, and also the inside. And you won't know that until the day that you go take your test. So that's it for the pre-trip inspection, and that should take care of everything. Hopefully you can watch over this and review the things that I mentioned. Maybe you might even find something that I forgot, which may have happened. And we can add it in later on. So thank you very much.